Let those churches committed to the Scriptures ask themselves, what stance should we have toward this? Can we afford to remain silent? Since God has not been silent on this subject, it is difficult for us to justify our own penchant for looking the other way and pretending we don't see what is happening. Yes, the church must speak, but what does it have to say? What would we say to the gay community if we were actually granted a hearing? Let's admit that there are many radicals who will not listen, but there are many others who may be listening to the church and waiting for a word. Perhaps even a majority who are in the homosexual lifestyle and would leave it if they thought they could. Their consciences are awakened to the wrongness of what they do, and yet they feel trapped. I believe that we as evangelicals have failed these people, many of whom populate our churches. As a pastor, I've listened to their stories of brokenness and heartache. I've heard stories of molestation, of the emptiness of sex without commitment, without love, and without caring. No matter what we see on television, the gay community is a hurting community, compulsively acting out behavior to cover their pain. These are people to whom we must have compassion, understanding, and care. We have to. On Sunday, I essentially preached this to my congregation. And afterwards, there's a young African-American, good-looking guy. And he's been a member of our church for about 6 months. And he said that he wept more during the message than he did at his mother's funeral. He said he just bawled through the whole thing. And I said, why were you crying? And he said, he was attracted to the fact that the message was presented graciously and with sensitivity. He said, that was my lifestyle. And he said that on the 28th of this month, in April, it will have been 1 year since I've had a relationship. It was during that period of time, in his sin, he cried out to God and was converted. But he still struggles with temptation. You see, if we as a church can only condemn, and we can't come along and help and encourage and counsel, where are we at? I'll tell you something that really changed my life, and I became a different person about this, was when I was asked to speak at an Exodus conference. You know, the Exodus, they have conferences for those who are coming out of homosexuality. I want you to understand this conference. 700 people, all of them gays and lesbians in various stages of coming out of the lifestyle. I remember having breakfast with many of these people, and 3 or 4 lesbians were there at the breakfast, and they felt free enough to tell me their story. Every one of them was molested by a father, a babysitter, some man, abused. And so what happens is they develop this hatred toward men, and in their hatred, then they want to act out their sexuality. They feel more comfortable with those of the same sex, and that's the way in which it begins. How do you think homosexuals come about? I interviewed a man who was a homosexual prostitute who estimated that he had 1,500 partners easily during his days as a prostitute. And he came to saving faith in Christ, and actually, in that instance, God changed his desires, and he became married. And eventually, even though he became married, even though he knew he had AIDS, he did not pass it on to his wife miraculously, and so he's in heaven today. His name is Roger. And I took him to the studios, and I interviewed him for an hour and a half because I wanted to know how he came out of it and how did he get into it. Here's a little boy, 8 years old. He's invited over to an older man in the neighborhood who's doing work in a garage. The older man begins to teach this little boy. The little boy doesn't have much of a father. The older man begins to molest this boy. The boy begins to think to himself that he both hates it and likes it simultaneously, because at last he has an older man who's paying attention to him. He grows up thinking, well, of course I'm gay. I said to him, how many do you think in the homosexual movement are in it today because they were molested as boys? And he said, I don't know, maybe 75%. That was his estimate. Do you realize that the community is hurting? And listen to me, they are hurting people, and all of the wells are dry. This man on Sunday told me, he said, if you knew what it was like to be locked into that lifestyle and to think that you cannot change. A woman, a lesbian, told me, She said, if somebody would have told me a year ago that I could come out of the lifestyle, she said it would have been equivalent to somebody asking me to lift this building. Absolutely impossible. Now, thankfully, God granted her grace. But I'm sharing my heart with you today, folks. There's a hurting world out there, and we had better realize that it is a hurting world.